The shovels hit the ground before he saw the men. Metal scraping wet earth. That sound, rough and ugly, cut through the trees like something alive. Ezra Calloway stopped walking. His breath hung in the cold air, white and thin. Rain had soaked through his jacket an hour ago. His sneakers were caked in mud, heavy like bricks. He was supposed to be cutting through Hollow Ridge Forest to get back to the shelter before the dinner line closed. He did this every Tuesday. Same path, same silence, same nothing. But tonight wasn't nothing. He pressed his back against the nearest oak. The bark bit into his shoulder blades through the wet fabric. His eyes adjusted. The trees thinned about 40 feet ahead, and through that gap, lantern light. Orange and low, flickering against the fog, and for shapes moving around something in the ground. Ezra didn't move, couldn't. His body already knew what his mind hadn't caught up to. The smell hit him first, dirt and iron. Something sharp underneath that, gun oil, metallic and cold in the back of his throat. Rain still fell in soft sheets around him, and every drop felt louder now. Every branch creak, every rustle. He pressed his lips together. His jaw tightened. He inched sideways, slow, knees bent low. Wet leaves peeled off the ground under his feet, soft enough. He moved to a cluster of brush, thick with dark leaves, and crouched behind it. Now he could see clearly. 4 men, black clothes. One holding a lantern, one standing watch near a tree line, 2 working the shovels. The pit they were digging was already deep, maybe 5 feet, maybe more. He couldn't tell from this angle, but the dirt pile beside it was tall. They had been out here a while. Then the man with the lantern crouched down, and Ezra saw what was inside the pit. Person, wrists bound with thick rope in front of him. White dress shirt, smeared with blood on the collar. Dress pants, now dirty and torn at the knee. The man was alive barely. His head hung forward, chin nearly to his chest. But his chest moved. Down. One of the diggers said something sharp and low. The other one laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh people make when they've already decided something is over. Ezra's stomach turned. A burn started low in his gut, working up into his chest. He knew he should go. He knew what a person with no voice, no money, no name, no anything was supposed to do when they stumbled onto something like this. Walk away. Move quiet. Forget you saw it. His feet didn't move. The man in the pit lifted his head slowly, like it weighed too much. His face was bruised, one eye swollen almost shut. Even in the bad light, Ezra could see the cut above his brow, dark and crusted. The man tried to shift position and couldn't. His arms were also tied behind him at the elbows, pulling his shoulders back at a painful angle. Ezra had seen that face before, on a billboard off Route 9, on the side of a bus, on a news ticker he'd watched through a diner window last winter while waiting for the cold to ease up. Devereaux Cole. Everyone knew that name. CEO of Cole Renner Holdings. Buildings with his name on them. A charity fundraiser the city talked about every fall. His face on magazine covers, always clean, always sharp, always looking like a man who had never once worried about where he'd sleep. Now he was bleeding in a hole in the ground, and 4 men were about to fill it. The burn in Ezra's chest climbed into his throat. He pressed his hand over his mouth. Not to stop a scream. He hadn't made a sound in years, not since he was 12, and even then it was barely a whisper before his voice gave out completely. He pressed his hand there because something in him wanted to gag, wanted to double over, wanted to make his body believe this wasn't real. His fingers were shaking. One of the men, the tallest one, the one standing near the tree line, turned his head slowly. Turned it in the direction of the brush. Ezra stopped breathing. The man stared into the dark. His jaw shifted. His hand moved toward his hip, where something heavy hung on his belt. Rain dripped off a leaf above Ezra. Hit the back of his neck. Cold, sharp. He did not blink. The tall man stood there for 5 full seconds. Then he turned back. Ezra let the breath out so slowly it was almost nothing. But his hands were still shaking. His knees pressed into the wet ground and pine needles stabbed through his jeans. He couldn't feel his toes anymore. He looked back at the pit. Devereux Cole had lifted his head again. This time, his one open eye was pointed directly at the cluster of brush. Directly at Ezra. Their eyes locked, and Ezra's entire body went cold. Not from the rain, not from the night air. Because Devereux Cole had seen him. Hi viewers, if you were Ezra in that moment, crouched in those bushes with no voice, no weapon, and for armed men 10 feet away, what would you do? Would you run? Or would you stay? Drop your answer in the comments right now because what Ezra decides next is going to shock you. The man in the pit didn't look away. His eye, dark, swollen, steady, stayed locked on the brush, on Ezra, and even through the bruising and the blood and the rain, something in that gaze shifted, something desperate and raw, not a call for help, not a plea, just recognition, just one person seeing another in the worst possible way. One of the diggers stabbed his shovel into the earth and said, 3 more feet. The other one wiped his hands on his thighs and looked at the sky. Weather's good cover. Let's not waste it. Ezra counted the men again. 4. 2 shovels. 1 lantern. At least 1 weapon he could see, probably more. The tall one was still near the trees, arms crossed, scanning the area in slow arcs. Methodical, like this wasn't his first time. Ezra's back pocket held a cracked phone with no service out here and 11% battery. His bag had half a granola bar, a water bottle, and a change of socks. He weighed maybe 140 pounds after a good meal, which he hadn't had. The odds were a joke. But Devereux Cole's eye was still on him. Still steady, like he was asking a question with just his face, with just that one open eye in all that dark and rain. And Ezra Calloway, who had been invisible his entire life, felt himself make a decision he couldn't take back. The shovel hit rock. One of the men cursed. The sound cracked through the quiet like a slap. The tall one near the trees turned. How deep? Deep enough, the digger said. He drove the blade in again, scraping it sideways. Give me 10 more minutes. 10 minutes. Ezra was still crouched in the brush. He had not moved. His knees had gone from painful to numb and his fingers felt like cold wood. Rain dripped off the leaves above him in a steady rhythm. The lantern light pushed long orange shadows through the trees. Devereux Cole had dropped his head again, either resting or losing consciousness. Ezra couldn't tell from here. He looked down at his bag, unzipped it slow, almost no sound. Inside, under the socks and the water bottle, a knife. Rusted handle, 3-inch blade, something he'd found wedged between a park bench and a concrete wall 2 winters ago. He'd kept it for situations he never thought he'd actually be in. He stared at it now, picked it up. The handle was rough against his palm. He mapped the clearing in his head. Lantern Man was crouched near the pit. 2 diggers in it and beside it. Tall man at the tree line. 20 feet to the left of Ezra's current position. He needed chaos. Something that would break their focus for even 30 seconds. He looked to his right. Deeper into the trees, maybe 15 feet away, a pile of dead branches had fallen from a split oak. Dry underneath, probably even with the rain. The brush around it was thick. Ezra set the knife between his teeth, reached into his bag, pulled out the granola bar wrapper and crumpled it slow. Then he pulled out the water bottle. He had 1 lighter in his jacket pocket. He always carried one. Not for anything dramatic, just to start a fire when he had to sleep outside, which was most of the time. He moved, low, slow, sideways through the brush, away from the clearing, arcing toward the pile of branches. Every step deliberate, every shift of weight measured. The rain helped. It swallowed small sounds, but it also made the leaves slick and his knees nearly slid twice. He made it to the branches. He kneeled down, felt underneath. Dry wood against his palm. He pulled a handful of thin, dead branches out and stacked them fast, hands moving by memory. He'd done this 100 times. His fingers knew the shape of it. He sparked the lighter. The flame caught on the second try. Small at first, orange tip eating up the smallest branch. He fed it with 3 more, blue on the base. The fire grew. Not a bonfire. Just a head-sized flame climbing the lowest branch, bright and crackling against the wet dark. Visible. He tucked the knife back in his hand and moved back toward the clearing. The men had already heard it. The hell is that? One of the diggers was out of the pit, pointing into the trees toward the flame. The tall man had moved, walking fast toward the fire, hand on his hip. The lantern man stood up. Could be nothing. Camper. In this rain. Two of them were moving toward the fire. Third was still near the pit, looking between the flame and the prisoner. Fourth lantern man started to follow the others. 3 seconds. Ezra moved. He crossed the clearing in a low run, feet hitting the muddy ground without a sound he could control, only hoping the rain and the arguing voices covered it. He dropped into the pit before the lantern man turned back. The cold hit him hard. The walls were packed earth, damp and dark. Devereaux Cole flinched at his arrival. Whole body jerking, a sharp breath through his nose where the cloth gag had shifted. Ezra put one hand on Cole's shoulder. Steady. I'm not going to hurt you. Cole stared at him, eyes wide now. Both of them. The swollen one had opened slightly, enough to catch the light. Ezra got the knife to the rope at Cole's wrists. Rusted blade, but he worked fast, sawing through where the knot was thick and bunched. The first layer of rope gave. He pulled. The second strand cut. Cole's arms dropped forward and he gasped. A low, broken sound, like joints that had been locked too long. A shout from the trees. Someone had seen the fire spread. Another voice. Forget it. Check the pit. Ezra grabbed Cole under the arm and pulled. Cole tried to stand and his legs didn't hold. They buckled, and Ezra caught him, both of them half falling against the pit wall. Mud on Ezra's face and hands and cold seeping through everything. He got his shoulder under Cole's arm and pushed up. Hard. They came over the edge of the pit together, tumbling onto the wet grass. A shot split the air. The sound was enormous and wrong, and it hit a tree 2 feet behind Ezra's left leg. Exploding bark. Ezra didn't stop. He moved. He pulled Cole with him, Cole's feet finding rhythm after the first few dragging steps, both of them pushing into the dark between the trees. Another shot. This one hit the mud 5 feet back. Then there were voices, running footsteps, someone shouting a name. Ezra and Cole ran. Through the dark, through branches that whipped and stung, through mud that sucked at their feet and tried to swallow their steps. Cole stumbled twice. Ezra caught him both times. Ezra's lungs were burning. The cold air felt like glass going in. He pushed past it, kept moving. The voices got farther behind them. The trees got thicker. They ran until the sounds of men were gone, replaced only by rain and the close dark. Then Cole's legs gave completely and he came down hard, and Ezra came with him, both of them hitting the wet ground, breathing loud and ragged. Cole's weight pressed against Ezra's side. Heavy, burning hot, even through the cold and the rain. His skin was radiant with fever, slick with sweat and mud. Ezra held him up. Cole's head dropped back against Ezra's shoulder. And then nothing. Still. Chest still moving, still breathing, but gone. Unconscious. The men's voices had faded, but they were still out there. And Devereaux Cole, one of the most powerful men in the country, was completely limp in Ezra Calloway's arms in the middle of the forest. Ezra looked up at the dark trees. He had about 10 minutes before his body stopped working in this cold. And absolutely no plan. The shed smelled like rust and old rain. Ezra found it by memory, not sight. He'd sheltered here twice before during bad storms. An old maintenance outpost at the edge of the Park District land, forgotten by whoever used to maintain it. The lock on the door had been broken since he first found it. He pushed it open with his shoulder, Cole's arm draped over his neck, Cole's feet dragging through the mud behind them. The inside was small, enough for a workbench, a rusted shelf unit, a cracked concrete floor. A folded tarp in the corner that smelled like mildew but was dry. He got Cole to the floor, rolled the tarp out, and pulled it over him as much as it would cover. Then he stood in the dark, chest heaving, and let himself shake for exactly 30 seconds. Just 30. Then he stopped. He worked. His bag still had the water bottle. He used his jacket sleeve, the cleanest part he could find, to clean the gash above Cole's brow. Pressed firm. The bleeding had slowed, at least. Cole's wrists were raw and torn from the rope, the skin broken in rings around both. Ezra wrapped them using the one dry sock from his bag, tying it carefully at the palm. He worked by feel mostly, the only light coming from the small gapped boards on the shed's east wall where the moon cut through in thin white lines. Cole's breathing was shallow but steady. His skin burned. Ezra sat back on his heels and studied the man's face. The billboard version of Devereaux Cole had been sharp and composed. Even in a photo, he looked like someone who had never doubted a single decision. This version, muddy, bruised, one eye still half swollen shut, fever climbing, looked like a person. Just a person. Someone's weight of bone and skin and blood. Ezra found that unsettling in a way he couldn't fully name. He drank some of the water, rationed it 2 small sips, then capped it. He'd need it more when Cole woke up. He pressed his back against the wall and kept his eyes on the door. The rain outside had settled into a steady, low sound, almost like breathing. He could feel his heart rate dropping slowly from the sprint. His leg muscles ached deep. Around midnight, he couldn't be sure, his phone had died in the run. Cole moved. Not awake, just shifting. His arm slid off the tarp and his hand hit the concrete floor, and the contact made him flinch even in sleep. Ezra watched him settle again. He reached into the bag and found the granola bar wrapper. Empty now since he'd used it to help catch the fire. He turned it over. Found the pen he always kept clipped to the inside pocket of his bag. Habit from years ago when a social worker told him he needed to find a way to communicate that didn't rely on paper from other people. He smoothed the wrapper flat against his knee. Nothing to write yet, but he held the pen. Sometime later, Cole's breathing changed, shallower for a moment. Then a sharp inhale. His eyes opened, both of them this time, the swollen one barely but open, and he looked at the ceiling of the shed like he was waiting to find out where he was. Ezra didn't move. Cole turned his head slowly, found Ezra in the dark. His expression shifted through about 5 things in 3 seconds. Confusion, fear, effort to place the memory, something like recognition, then a pain that had nothing to do with his body. He tried to sit up. Made it about 4 inches before his arms gave out and he dropped back with a sharp sound through his teeth. "Stay down," Ezra couldn't say. Instead he held one hand up, flat, and pressed it gently toward the floor. "Stay." Cole stared at the hand, then at Ezra's face. He stayed. Ezra reached over and picked up the water bottle. Held it out. Cole's hands were shaking too hard to hold it himself. Ezra held it for him. Cole drank 3 long pulls and closed his eyes for a moment. The muscles in his face loosened slightly, just that much, the way a person's face goes when they stop bracing for the next hit. The quiet between them was strange. Not uncomfortable. Just full of things there were no words for yet. And in Ezra's case, no way to say them even if there had been. Cole's lips moved. Ezra leaned in. It wasn't a full word. Just breath shaped like something, a name maybe, his own maybe. The fever made it drift and blur and Ezra couldn't catch it. He sat back. Outside, somewhere in the dark and rain, a sound. Far off. An engine. Then another. Ezra's hand went still around the water bottle. They were searching. The engine sounds came from the north side of the park. Then 2 more from the east. They had vehicles. Ezra turned to Cole, who had heard it too. His eyes were open, fixed on the shed door. Even sick and wrecked, the man's face had gone completely still. Alert. The kind of stillness that costs something. Ezra made a decision fast. He moved to the far corner of the shed, the one farthest from the door and the gapboards. He grabbed the 2 loose planks that had fallen from the shelving unit, rotted but solid enough, and propped them into a lean. Then he came back for Cole. Cole was already trying to sit up again, making it this time barely, upper body trembling. He got one knee under himself. Ezra got under his arm and they moved together to the corner, low and quiet, and Ezra got the boards angled over them both, a rough cover, enough to break a flashlight's sweep if the door held. He could feel Cole's fever against his own skin. Even through both their clothes, heat radiating off the man like a pressed iron. They didn't touch beyond what was necessary. Ezra pressed his back into the corner wall and kept his breathing controlled. He could hear Cole's breath, slower than it should be, ragged at the base, the kind of breathing that said the body was working too hard. The engine sounds got closer. Then a flashlight beam cut through the gap in the east wall. Ezra's hand closed around Cole's forearm. He didn't squeeze, just rested there, the way you'd hold a person who was about to make a noise without knowing it. Cole didn't make a noise. He pressed himself flat against the wall. The beam swept across the floor, hit the tarp, the workbench, the rusted shelves. Paused on the tarp 3 full seconds, Ezra counted, then moved on. Outside, footsteps in the mud. Voices. Nothing. Old building. A second voice. He couldn't have gone far. Not in that shape. First voice again. Quieter now. He went somewhere. Man doesn't just vanish. Footsteps pausing. Close right outside the door. The latch rattled once. Ezra's whole body went rigid. Cole's arm was iron under his hand. Then footsteps moved away. The flashlight beam disappeared. Engines idled, moved, faded. Ezra counted to 200 before he moved his hand. Cole let out a breath that had been held so long it shook everything in him. He slumped slightly and Ezra let him, just a fraction of lean, just enough to not be actively fighting the weight of staying upright. They stayed in the corner for another hour, just to be sure. Cole drifted in and out. Fever dreams, probably. At one point his lips moved and Ezra, who had gotten very good at reading lips over the years, caught the word, "Wrong one." He didn't know what that meant. He filed it away. Later, when the rain had softened to almost nothing and the engine sounds hadn't returned for a long stretch, Cole's eyes opened again. Clear this time. More present. He looked at Ezra for a long moment. Then, low and rough, barely above breath, he said, "Why?" Not even a full sentence. Just that one word, and the question mark was somewhere in the way his voice fell at the end. Ezra reached into his jacket pocket, found the pen, reached into his bag for the granola bar wrapper, already written on one side from earlier, nothing important, just a number he'd been tracking. He turned it over to the clean side and pressed it flat against his thigh. He wrote, "I was there. I saw." He held it out. Cole read it. His face moved through something, not surprise exactly. More like someone who had asked a question and still couldn't process the answer. He looked up from the wrapper. Looked at Ezra. Ezra put the pen back. Held Cole's gaze. Cole blinked slowly. The fever was still in him, visible in the slight shine of his skin, the way his eyes were just a half-degree too bright. But his jaw was set. His hands, despite the trembling, were folded. Deliberate. He looked like he was trying to make a decision and didn't trust his own judgment enough to make it yet. "You didn't have to," he said, still quiet. "You could have kept walking." Ezra shrugged, one shoulder small. Cole watched that shrug for a moment, like it told him something he wasn't ready to say out loud. His head dropped back against the wall. "They'll come back," he said. "More of them next time." He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him back down. And Ezra sat in the dark corner of that broken shed, Cole's fever burning against the night, and wrote one more thing on the wrapper, even though Cole was already asleep and couldn't read it. "I know." Pain was the first thing. Devereaux Cole woke to it, a full inventory of damage, his body listing everything at once the moment consciousness returned. His wrists, his shoulders pulled back too long, the gash above his right brow that had a dull, deep throb behind it. His ribs on the left side where someone had put a boot in twice. He didn't move right away. He lay still and let his mind catch up. The shed ceiling, cracked wood, a line of gray morning light through the wall gap. He turned his head slowly. The fever had broken or at least stepped back enough for his thinking to sharpen. He felt the rough texture of a tarp beneath him, the cold concrete under that. He felt the sock wrapped around his right wrist, carefully tied. Carefully. He sat up. Took 3 seconds to manage it. His arms shook. He got upright and pressed his back against the wall and looked around the shed. The young man was asleep on the floor by the door, sitting with his back against the wall, arms folded across his chest, head tipped slightly to one side. His shoes were caked in dry mud. His jacket was thin, too thin for this weather, and there was dried blood on the sleeve that probably wasn't his. He looked like someone who had learned to sleep light years ago and never stopped. Devereaux studied him. Young, maybe mid-20s. Dark skin, angular face, hands that were roughened, the kind you got from living outside or close to it, not from any job. A pen clipped to the inside of a worn bag. A busted phone. Clothes clean but threadbare. Nothing about him that said comfort. Nothing that said anyone was looking out for him. He had still pulled Devereaux out of a pit. The memory of it came back in sharp pieces. The smoke and light in the trees. The weight of rope finally gone from his wrists. The voice that never came because there wasn't one. Just hands. Just motion. Just someone making decisions faster than Devereaux's half-conscious brain could follow. He looked at the granola bar wrapper on the floor. Picked it up. I was there. I saw. Simple. 2 sentences. No name. He turned it over. On the other side, the same handwriting. I know. He put the wrapper down. His memory kept going. The men in the trees. The plan they'd said out loud because they thought he was already gone enough not to understand. Names they'd used. Instructions passed between them in clipped, familiar shorthand, the kind people used when they'd worked together a long time. He knew 2 of those names. He'd trusted both of them. That knowledge sat in his chest like a stone dropped in deep water. No splash, just the weight of it going down. He looked at his hands. The rope marks were dark red, some of the skin broken. The sock clean, which meant the boy had given him his own, was tied in a neat double knot at the palm. He pressed his thumb against the knot and felt the pressure of it. Someone he didn't know had chosen to stop. Had decided his life was worth the risk of theirs. Devereaux Cole had built an empire on the idea that everyone had a price, that every decision came down to cost-benefit, that people moved in their own interest always. He had believed that so thoroughly he'd stopped checking it. He checked it now. The boy across the shed had no reason, no angle, no possible gain from pulling a stranger out of a hole. By any logic Devereaux understood, he should have kept walking. He hadn't. That fact had no category in Devereaux's current system. He didn't know what to do with it. The morning light shifted. The boy's eyes opened. Not startled, no jolt. Just eyes coming open the way someone's did when they'd been half awake for a while already. He looked at Devereaux immediately, checking. The way you checked on someone you'd been worried about. Devereaux held up the wrapper. The boy looked at it. Then at Devereaux's face. Devereaux said, "You're mute." It wasn't a question. He'd worked it out. No sound during the entire escape. No sound now. The pen. The wrapper. The way he communicated entirely through his hands and his face. The boy didn't flinch at the word. He just nodded once. Flat and unconcerned. The way you nodded at a fact you'd long since made peace with. Devereaux nodded back. He leaned his head against the wall. Outside, birds had started. The rain was gone. It felt almost absurd, this ordinary morning sound around all of this. His head was already working through problems. Contact. He had people who would be looking for him by now or should be. Getting a message out without being traced back to this location. Medical attention. The fever, while less acute, wasn't gone. His ribs needed imaging. He needed to move. He got his legs under himself and pushed off the wall. Made it to standing. The shed tilted slightly and he put one hand out against the wall and breathed through it. His legs held. The boy was on his feet instantly. Close but not touching. Watching. Devereaux took 3 careful steps toward the door. His left leg was worse than he'd thought. The knee had twisted at some point during the run. He put weight on it and it held, but barely. He stopped. The boy was watching him with an expression that was impossible to read except for one thing underneath it all. Alarm. Not for himself. For Devereaux. Devereaux straightened. Looked at the boy directly. "I can arrange a way out of here," he said. "For me. Safe passage. My people." He paused. Chose the next words with weight. "But I need you to understand something." The boy waited. Devereaux's voice came down low. Quiet and absolute, the way he spoke when what he was saying was not a theory but a fact. "They'll kill you for this." The boy's expression didn't collapse, didn't break. His jaw tightened. His eyes stayed steady. But his hands, just slightly, closed into fists at his sides. And the morning light came through the shed wall in thin, cold lines, and neither of them moved. The shack was empty before Ezra even pushed the door open. He felt it. That specific kind of empty, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses back. He stood in the doorway anyway, hand on the frame, and looked at the space where Devereaux Cole had been. The tarp was folded. Not kicked aside, not bunched, folded. Corners aligned. Set against the wall like someone had taken the time to do it right before they left. Ezra stood there for a long moment. He didn't go in. He already knew. Cole's people had come in the night, the way Cole said they would. Quiet, fast, no announcement. Just hands in the dark. A man lifted. A vehicle waiting on the park road with its lights off. Gone before morning. Ezra turned around and walked back the way he'd come. The forest was different in daylight. Less pressing. The trees just stood there, still and ordinary, like none of it had happened. His sneakers were still caked with dried mud from 2 nights ago. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since then. His ribs ached from where he'd hit the ground during the run, and the blisters on his right heel had opened again somewhere between mile 1 and mile 2. He got back to the shelter at 7:14 in the morning. The dinner line was long gone. Breakfast too. He sat on the concrete steps outside with his bag between his feet and ate the last third of a protein bar he found in the bottom of the front pocket. It was stale. He chewed it anyway. The city moved around him. Cars. A delivery truck backing up across the street. That loud beep. 2 kids running past with a dog that had no leash. A woman on her phone, coffee in her other hand, not looking at anything. Ezra watched all of it and felt nothing connect. That was the thing about saving someone's life he was starting to understand. Nobody told you what came after. Nobody warned you that you'd be sitting on cold concrete the next morning eating a stale protein bar while the world kept moving like you hadn't just cut a man out of a hole in the ground. Cole was somewhere warm right now, probably a hospital. Probably clean sheets and an 4-line and a doctor with a clipboard and people who mattered to him standing in a doorway asking if he needed anything. And Ezra was here. Same as always. He slept that night on the floor of the shelter, 3rd cot from the left, the one with the broken leg that tilted slightly right. He'd had it so many times he'd learned to sleep on the tilt. He closed his eyes and the forest came back. The shovels, the lantern, the pit, Cole's one open eye in the dark. He pushed it down. Slept. 3 nights passed. Then 4. By the 5th morning he had stopped thinking about it the way you stop touching a bruise. Not because it stopped hurting, but because touching it wasn't doing anything useful. He went back to his routine. The park path. The library in the afternoons, where it was warm and the librarian, Ms. Tambra, let him sit at the corner table near the window without asking him any questions. He read. He wrote small things on whatever paper he had. He watched people move through the library like they had somewhere to be. He was running out of food. That was real and pressing in a way that the memory of Devereaux Cole was not. He had $4.60. Enough for one thing from the corner market. He stretched it. Instant oatmeal, store brand, 3 packets for $1.89. That was 2 days if he was careful. On the 6th night he had a dream. Not about the forest. About the tarp. Folded. Corners aligned. He woke up at 3 a.m. on the tilted cot and stared at the shelter ceiling and understood, slowly, what the folded tarp meant. It wasn't housekeeping. It was a message. Someone who is about to forget you doesn't fold the tarp. He didn't know what to do with that thought, so he put it somewhere and went back to sleep. The news ran a small item on day 7. He saw it through the window of a bar he was passing. The TV up on the wall, volume off, captions rolling. Devereaux Cole, CEO of Cole-Renner Holdings, had been hospitalized following what his representatives described as a medical emergency while traveling. He was recovering. There would be no further comment. Medical emergency while traveling. Ezra looked at that caption for a long time. He thought about the pit, the rope, the men with shovels, the shot that took bark off a tree 2 feet from his left leg. Medical emergency while traveling. He kept walking. The oatmeal ran out on day 8. Day 9, he found half a sandwich someone had left on a park bench. He ate it standing up, watching pigeons. It was turkey and something that had gone a little off but not enough to stop. He finished it and crumpled the wrapper. He thought about hunger the way he'd been thinking about it his whole life. Not as a crisis, because a crisis implied it wasn't normal. It was just the texture of things. The baseline. The weather you lived in when no one was looking out for you and you had stopped expecting them to start. He was back at the shelter by 9. He climbed the 3 steps to the front door. And someone knocked. Not on the shelter door. On the wall beside him. 2 sharp knocks, precise and deliberate, the kind of knock that came from someone who was very used to being answered. Ezra turned. A man stood on the sidewalk 6 feet away. Big. Wide through the shoulders, neck like a piece of construction equipment. Dark suit, no tie, earpiece in. His hands were at his sides and he was looking at Ezra with the flat, patient expression of someone who had been told exactly where to go and exactly who to find. He said, "Mr. Calloway." Not a question. He knew the name already. Ezra's hand tightened on the strap of his bag. The man held up one hand, slow, open-palmed. "Easy. Mr. Cole sent me," he said. The shelter door was 10 inches behind Ezra. He could go through it, disappear into the building. The man probably wouldn't follow him inside. Probably. It would be the safe move. Ezra didn't move. He stood on the steps in the cold and looked at this man and felt something in his chest shift. Not toward trust, not yet, not close, but toward something. Some version of a question he hadn't known he was waiting to have answered. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card. Not a business card. A folded piece of paper. He held it out. Ezra stepped down and took it. He unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, the kind that came from writing with hands that had recently been untied and were still working their way back to normal. But it was legible. Clear. For lines. The first line said, "I owe you more than I can calculate." The second said, "You are in danger and I know where you are." The third said, "Come with Marquis. You don't have to trust me yet." The fourth line said, "But please come." Ezra read it twice. He looked up at the man, Marquis, who was still standing with that same flat, patient expression, hands visible, waiting. Ezra folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, picked up his bag, and followed. The car was black and warm and smelled like leather and something faintly like cedar. Ezra sat in the back with his bag on his lap and watched the city move past the window. Marquis drove without speaking, which Ezra appreciated. There was no music, just the hum of the engine and the sound of tires on wet pavement and the city going by in lit windows and wet streets and all the ordinary life of people who didn't know anything unusual had happened. They drove for 22 minutes. Ezra counted. The building they stopped in front of was not what he expected. No tower. No name in gold letters on glass. Just a wide brownstone on a quiet block, 3 stories, deep-set windows, black iron gate that Marquis opened with a code. A regular-looking place that cost more per square foot than Ezra would make in his life. Marquis held the gate. Ezra walked through. The inside of the building was warm. Not hotel warm, not office warm. The kind of warm that came from a place that was actually lived in. Books on shelves, a jacket hung over a chair, a coffee cup left on a side table. A lamp on in the corner of a front room throwing a low, yellow circle of light. Ezra Cole was standing at the far end of the front room. He looked different. That was the first thing. Clean clothes. No blood, no mud, no fever. His hair was cut and his face was shaved and he was standing upright without shaking. His left eye still had the last bruise of what had been a bad swelling, a yellow-green shadow under the bone, but his eyes were clear, alert, fixed on Ezra the moment he walked in. His left arm was in a brace at the elbow. His right hand held nothing. Ezra stopped in the middle of the room. They looked at each other. Devereaux said, "You look like you haven't eaten in 4 days." Ezra pulled out the pen and the piece of paper he always had and wrote. 5. He held it up. Something moved through Devereaux's face. Not surprise. Something else. Something that looked like it cost him. He turned to Marquis and said something quiet. Marquis nodded and disappeared into the back of the house. Devereaux looked back at Ezra. "Sit down," he said. "Please." Ezra sat. Not on the couch, not on the wide armchair, on the wooden chair near the door. The one closest to the exit. He kept his bag on his lap. Devereaux noticed. He didn't comment on it. He sat down across from him, on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, and looked at Ezra the way someone looks at something they've been thinking about for a long time and aren't sure they're seeing correctly now that it's in front of them. "I'm going to say some things," Devereaux said. "And I need you to hear them out before you leave. Can you do that?" Ezra held the pen. "Waited," Devereaux said. "The men who were in that forest work for a man named Terence Odom. He's on my board. Has been for 9 years. He paused. "He's also my brother-in-law," Ezra wrote. "The one who paid them?" Devereaux looked at the paper. "One of two. There's a second person. I don't have a name yet, but I have a direction." He sat back slightly. "The reason I'm telling you this is because Terence knows you exist. He doesn't know who you are yet. But he knows someone pulled me out of that pit and he has people looking." Ezra's pen was still on the paper. He wrote, slowly, "How long until he finds me? That's why Marquis went to you tonight instead of tomorrow." Devereaux said it flat. Direct. No decoration on it. "Days. Maybe less." Ezra looked at the paper. Then at the room. Then at Devereaux. He wrote, "What do you want from me?" Devereaux was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "I want to give you something. Safety. A place that isn't that shelter. Time." He looked at his own hands, the rope marks still visible on his wrists, darker on the right. "You gave me my life. I can't pretend that's a normal thing and do nothing about it." Ezra wrote, "I don't want your money." "I know," Devereaux said. He didn't argue it. He said it like it was information he'd already filed. "I'm not offering money. I'm offering the one thing I can actually provide right now, which is that the people looking for you won't find you here." Ezra looked at him. Devereaux held the look. He didn't flinch from it, didn't fill the silence with more words. He just sat there and let Ezra read whatever he needed to read in his face. And what Ezra read was this. A man who had been wrong about the people around him for a long time and was now, slowly, painfully, by force, learning to be careful with what he said, because words were the only currency he had left that hadn't been used against him. Marquis came back from the kitchen. Food. A real plate, something hot, something with actual weight to it. He set it on the side table near Ezra's chair without ceremony and stepped back. Ezra looked at the plate. He looked at Devereaux. Devereaux said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight. Just eat." Ezra picked up the fork. He ate, and somewhere in that act, something that small, something that ordinary, a line shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but the place where trust might eventually stand. After the plate was empty, Ezra set the fork down and wrote one thing on the paper and slid it across the table. Said, "I'm afraid. Not of Terence Odom. Not of the men. Just afraid. The general kind. The kind that came from a life spent understanding that things that looked safe had a way of not staying that way." Devereaux read it. He didn't try to talk him out of it. He said, "I know. I'm afraid too." Then, quiet, "You don't belong out there anymore. Not now. Not after what you did." Ezra sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up his bag, didn't put it down, didn't leave it by the door, and looked at Devereaux and gave a single, small nod. Not yes to everything. Just, for now. Just one night. Marquis showed him to a room on the second floor. Small, clean, a window that looked out onto the quiet street. A bed with actual weight to the blanket. A lamp on the table. Ezra sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before he lay down. He kept his shoes on, just in case. He kept the shoes on for 3 nights. By the 4th, he left them by the bed instead of on his feet. Small difference. But it was a difference. The room on the second floor became, without ceremony or announcement, his room. A change of clothes appeared on the chair. Nothing expensive, nothing that made a statement, just clean and the right size. He didn't ask where they came from. He folded them and used them. Devereaux Cole's house had a rhythm to it that Ezra learned without trying. Marquis arrived at 7 each morning and left after dark. A woman named Celestine came 3 times a week to cook. She was maybe 60, moved like someone who had been cooking professionally since before Ezra was born, and she acknowledged his presence the same way she acknowledged the furniture, with complete calm and zero fuss. That suited him fine. Devereaux worked from a room on the ground floor. Long hours. Phone calls that went late into the evening. His voice carrying low and controlled through the house. Never loud enough to make out words. Just the shape of a man trying to manage something large that had been badly damaged. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. In the mornings Ezra would come down and Devereaux would be at the kitchen table with coffee. Already dressed, already in the day. He'd look up when Ezra came in. Nod. Go back to whatever he was reading. Ezra would pour coffee. He'd learned where the cups were on day 2, and sit at the other end of the table, and they'd be in the same room without making demands of each other. It was the strangest thing Ezra had ever experienced. Not bad strange, just new. On the 6th day, Devereaux set a notebook on the table beside Ezra's coffee. Not a scrap, not a wrapper. A real notebook, the kind with a good spine and thick pages and a pen looped through the cover. He didn't say anything about it. Just set it there and went back to his work. Ezra picked it up. He opened to the first page and sat there for a while. Then he wrote, "I've been invisible my whole life. Not like a superpower. Like a problem nobody wanted to solve." He closed the notebook. That evening, Devereaux was in the front room when Ezra came through. Ezra sat down in the wooden chair, still the one near the door, still the habit, and set the notebook on the table between them. He opened it to the first page and turned it around. Devereaux read it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know what invisible looks like. I've been the one doing the not seeing." He set the notebook down. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. Just saying I understand it better now." Ezra pulled the notebook back. Wrote, "What happened to you in that pit before I got there?" Devereaux looked at the question. He said, "They took me from my own parking garage. 3 of Terrence's men and a 4th I didn't recognize. I had a driver with me, Kellen. He's in the hospital. He'll recover." His jaw tightened. "I spent about 2 hours in the back of a truck before the forest. They wanted me to sign things first. Documents." He stopped. "I didn't sign." Ezra wrote, "That's why they moved to the pit." "Yes." Ezra wrote, "What were the documents?" Devereaux was quiet for a moment. Not hedging. Thinking about how to explain something complicated in a way that was honest. "A transfer of controlling interest in Cole Renner," he said. "If I signed, Terrence and whoever he's working with would have the company. They'd also have a signed document making it look voluntary, which would hold up in court while I was..." He stopped. "While they were handling the other problem being him, dead in the ground." Ezra looked at the notebook. Wrote, "You said 2 names in your sleep. In the shed. You said wrong one." Devereaux looked at him. "You read lips," he said. Ezra nodded once. Devereaux sat back. Something passed over his face. Not quite a smile, but the edge of one. The kind that came from respect, not humor. "Wrong one," he repeated. "I said that because I had a moment in the pit where I thought the person coming toward me was another one of Terrence's men. I thought it was the end." He looked at his hands. "And then I looked at you, and I thought, you're not one of them. You're not dressed right. You're not moving right. You're too young and too thin, and you came down into that pit without a weapon that would have actually helped you." He paused. "You came down because you decided to, not because anyone told you to." Ezra held the pen. He didn't write anything. Devereaux said, "In 9 years of running a company worth what mine is worth, I have never once had someone make a decision like that for me. Every person around me had an angle, a reason, something they needed." He looked at Ezra directly. "You had nothing to gain, and you came anyway." Ezra wrote, "I had everything to lose." Devereaux read it. Yeah, he said. Quiet. You did. The notebook stayed open on the table between them. Pages filling slowly over the following days, Ezra's handwriting on some, Devereaux's on others where he'd write a response and slide it back. Not a conversation exactly. More like two people building something with their hands, slow and careful, testing each joint before they put weight on it. On the 9th day, Marquis came in at a different time. Not 7 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. And he didn't come alone. He came with another man, younger, tight expression, something held back behind his eyes. He spoke to Devereaux in a low, fast voice near the front door. Ezra was at the kitchen table with the notebook. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see Devereaux's face. And that face, composed, controlled, never without a plan, went still in a way Ezra hadn't seen since the pit. Devereaux turned from the door. He looked at Ezra. He said, "Terrence knows the shelter. He had someone watching it. They traced the car." His voice was level, controlled, but underneath it something was pulled wire-tight. "They're going to move tonight." Ezra closed the notebook. He stood up. Devereaux said, "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Ezra picked up his bag. Still kept it ready, still kept it packed, the shoes by the bed habit now making complete sense, and looked at Devereaux with an expression that said, "I know you mean that. I'm not sure it's yours to decide." Marquis said, "Car's ready. We move in 10. They moved in 8. The convoy was 3 vehicles. Ezra was in the second one with Devereaux, Marquis driving, another man in the passenger seat whose name Ezra didn't know. The city moved past the windows, ordinary and indifferent. They were 4 blocks from the house when the lead vehicle braked hard. Then the rear vehicle. Something was wrong. Marquis said one word. A name, sharp, and the car lurched left. A sound like something striking the side panel. Then another. Not a crash. Not an accident. Ezra felt the car swerve. Felt Devereaux's arm come across him. Automatic, a reflex. And then the window on Ezra's side went dark as something large pressed against it from outside and the door came open in hands. Multiple, practiced, fast, reached in. Ezra had time for exactly one thought before he was pulled out of the car. It was not fear. It was, "I should have kept the shoes on." The room they put him in was cold and smelled like concrete and old oil. No windows. One door with a bolt on the outside. He'd heard it slide. A single light overhead. Bare bulb. No shade. A metal chair in the center of the floor. They had zip-tied his wrists in front of him, which told him something. They wanted him functional enough to be useful. That meant he wasn't dead yet. That mattered. Ezra sat in the metal chair and ran through what he knew. The convoy had been hit on a city block, which meant someone had eyes on the house from outside. Either a tail they'd missed or a feed they hadn't found. He'd been pulled from the second vehicle. He hadn't seen what happened to Devereaux. That part burned. He didn't know how long the drive had taken. He'd been pressed face forward against a seat with something over his head. Rough fabric, some kind of bag. The car had been cold and the road was smooth for most of it. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe 30. Still in the city, probably. The door opened. The man who came in was not one of the 4 from the forest. Ezra catalogued that immediately. 50s. Gray at the temples, trimmed. A suit that cost money. His eyes were the kind of calm that came not from peace but from practice. A man who had made decisions that hurt other people for long enough that he'd stopped feeling the weight of them. Terrence Odom. He looked at Ezra for a moment without speaking. Then he pulled a chair from the corner. Ezra hadn't seen it in the dim light, and sat down 6 feet away and crossed his legs like this was a business meeting. "You pulled him out," Terrence said. Not asking. He had the tone of someone reviewing a fact they already verified. "Why?" Ezra looked at him. He didn't reach for a pen. Didn't perform helplessness. He just looked. Terrence studied him. "Mute," he said after a moment. "I know that. I'm not asking for a conversation." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm telling you what your situation is. Right now, Devereaux is trying to find you. He's making calls he doesn't have the capacity to make because his network is compromised and he doesn't fully know it yet." He paused. "You are leverage. That's what you are to me. And when he comes, and he will come, I will trade you for something I need, and then this is over. Ezra held the man's gaze. Terence said, the smart move for you is to sit still and wait. You'll go home. No permanent damage. This isn't about you. Something settled in Ezra's chest. Not fear. Not even anger. Something older than both. The thing that happened in a person who had been invisible so long that they learned to see everything, because no one was watching them watch. He looked at Terence Odom and he started counting. Not seconds. Details. The suit jacket was on. But it was buttoned wrong. One button off at the bottom, which meant he'd dressed in a hurry or been interrupted while dressing. His right shoe had a scuff on the toe cap that was fresh. Pale against the polish, the kind you got from kicking something in frustration. His phone was in his left breast pocket, not his right. He kept touching it with 2 fingers, a small tap, like checking a pulse. He was not as calm as he was performing. Something was going wrong for Terence Odom tonight. And Ezra had not been sitting still in this chair. He'd been working the zip tie against the edge of the chair seat, which had a rough weld on the underside that he'd found in the first 30 seconds. The plastic was abrading. Slow but moving. Terence stood up. I'll come back. He left. The bolt slid home. Ezra worked faster. The tie broke 11 minutes later. He pulled his wrists apart, slow so the sound didn't carry. He sat still for another 30 seconds, just listening. Nothing from outside the door. Distant voices, muffled. Farther than the immediate hallway. He stood up. The room had nothing useful except the metal chair and the bare bulb. He stood on the chair and unscrewed the bulb. Room went dark, and held it. Fragile, but glass was glass. He moved to the wall beside the door. Waited. 14 minutes. The bolt slid. The door opened inward and the man who came through was not Terence. Younger, moving fast, one hand already reaching for the light switch that was no longer going to do anything. 2 seconds of confusion. That was enough. What happened next took 6 seconds and left the man on the floor with a dislocated shoulder and Ezra in the hallway with a phone that had been in the man's right hip pocket and a key fob that probably belonged to a vehicle somewhere in this building. The hallway was concrete. Industrial. This was not a house, it was a warehouse space, converted partially, still mostly raw. Fluorescent lights overhead. 2 doors to the left, 1 to the right, a set of stairs at the far end going up. Voices above. Ezra went right. The door on the right opened into a loading bay. Cold air. The smell of exhaust and wet asphalt. A rolling metal door half raised. 1 black SUV parked inside. He hit the key fob. The SUV blinked. He moved. He was behind the wheel in 4 seconds. Engine on in 5. He hit the rolling door button on the fob, it started moving, and he was out before it finished opening, scraping the roof slightly, not stopping for it. The street outside was dark and industrial and he recognized nothing. He drove 2 blocks, turned, found a street name, pulled the stolen phone, and called the only number that would mean anything. It rang once. Devereaux picked up before the second ring was finished. He said, Ezra. Ezra held the phone to his ear. He couldn't say anything back. That was the thing. He had the phone, he had the line, and he could not produce a single sound to tell the man on the other end that he was alive and moving and 3 blocks from wherever he'd just been. He heard Devereaux's breathing on the line. Heard him understand the silence. Keep the call open, Devereaux said. Low and steady. Don't hang up. I'm triangulating the phone. Marquis, go. Ezra kept driving. He drove until headlights appeared behind him, the right kind, the familiar shape of Devereaux's vehicles, and he pulled over and they surrounded the SUV and the door opened and Marquis was there and then Devereaux was there, coat open, moving fast across the wet street, and Ezra got out of the stolen car and stood on the asphalt in the cold. Devereaux stopped 2 feet from him. He looked at Ezra, all of him quickly, the way you checked a person for damage. And then his face did something Ezra hadn't seen it do. It broke open. Just for a second. Just enough. Are you hurt? He said. Ezra shook his head. Devereaux let out a breath that he'd been holding for what looked like hours. Then he said, We have him, Terence. His location, his accounts, the documents he used, the second name, we have everything. His voice was controlled again, but it was a different kind of controlled, not the old kind, the board meeting kind. Something new in it. Something that sounded like relief and fury occupying the same space at the same time. It's over. His piece of it is over. Ezra pulled out the stolen phone, opened the Notes app, typed 3 words and turned the screen toward Devereaux. The second name. Devereaux looked at the screen. His jaw tightened. "You heard it," he said. Ezra nodded. In that cold room. Terrence had been on a call when the door opened the second time. Ezra had heard it through the wall, enough of it. A name. Clear twice. Someone who was not Terrence's man. Someone inside Cole Renner. Someone Devereaux had promoted 18 months ago. Devereaux looked at the name on the screen for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you." Simple. No decoration on it. Just, "Thank you." The weight of everything that lived inside those 2 words took up the whole street. Ezra put the phone in his pocket. He stood in the cold on the wet asphalt, the city loud and ordinary around them, and felt something shift in his chest. Not fixed. Not all the way. But something that had been held at an angle for as long as he could remember moved slightly, just slightly, toward level. Devereaux looked at him. And then, quietly, with the kind of honesty that came from a man who had just spent the last several hours afraid in a way he hadn't been afraid since a pit in a dark forest, he said, "I can't stop thinking about the fact that you came back into that building on your own." Ezra pulled out the notebook. He wrote, "I wasn't going to sit still and wait for someone to trade me." Devereaux read it. He almost smiled. Almost. "No," he said. "I don't think you were." Marquis said, "We need to move." They moved. And behind them, the warehouse sat dark and quiet, and Terrence Odom's plan for taking everything came apart in exactly the way all plans that rely on underestimating the wrong person eventually come apart. Completely. 6 months later, the forest looked different. That was the first thing Ezra noticed when he walked the path again. Same trees. Same mud in the low spots after rain. Same birds at the same hour making the same sounds they always made. But the forest looked different because he looked different. Not in any way another person would clock from across the street, not in his face or the clothes he was wearing, though both had changed. Different in the way he moved through it. No quick pulse at shadows. No inventory of exits. Just his feet on the ground and the cold morning air and the particular smell of wet earth and bark that he would now always associate with the night that changed everything, but without the fear attached to it anymore. Or most of the fear. Some of it would always be there. That was honest. He walked until he reached the clearing. It was just a clearing now. Overgrown slightly, the way untouched ground reclaimed itself fast. No pit. The rain and the time had smoothed the soil back to flat, and new growth had pushed through in the spots where the earth had been disturbed. Green and stubborn and completely indifferent to what had happened there. Nature did not hold grudges. Ezra stood at the edge of the clearing for a while. He thought about Terrence Odom, who was now in federal custody pending trial on charges that took a 12-page document to list. His assets had been frozen. His seat on the Cole Renner board had been vacated. The second name, Marcus Bellard, who had been head of internal acquisitions for 18 months, had been arrested 2 days after Ezra typed it on that stolen phone screen. The documents Terrence had wanted Devereaux to sign had been used as evidence of conspiracy instead of as a transfer of power. Everything Terrence had built in 9 years had taken about 3 weeks to fully collapse once it started. Devereaux had testified. Quiet, detailed, precise. The way he did everything. Kellen, his driver, was walking again. Limping slightly, which the doctors said might not fully resolve, but walking. Ezra pulled his jacket tighter. He thought about the last 6 months in pieces, the way you thought about something that had been too large to hold all at once. The first month had been legal proceedings. Depositions, statements, documents. Ezra had given his through a lawyer Devereaux hired. A woman named Adrienne Voss, who was small and extremely precise and who communicated with Ezra through a combination of typed exchanges and a no-nonsense patience that he appreciated. He didn't have to speak to anyone in person unless he chose to. He chose not to. His written account was accepted as complete. The second month, Devereaux had said, "I want to show you something." He had shown Ezra a building. Not Cole Renner. A different one, smaller, a few blocks from the shelter where Ezra had lived. A building that had been sitting empty for 2 years, bought by a holding company Devereaux had formed quietly, waiting. On the ground floor, a community resource center, still in renovation. On the second floor, 12 units of housing, rent stabilized and real. Devereaux had handed Ezra a key. Ezra had looked at the key for a long time. Then he'd written, "I can't let you pay for this because I saved your life." Devereaux had read it and said, "I'm not paying for it because you saved my life. I'm doing it because it should exist. You just showed me that the person who would use it most was a person I should have already known about." Different thing entirely. Ezra had taken the key. The unit was on the second floor, corner position. A window that got morning light. A small table where he put the notebook, by now the third one, the first two filled. A shelf he built himself, badly, with materials from the hardware store 2 blocks down. The bracket on the left side sat slightly crooked. He left it that way. The city from that window looked different than it had from the shelter steps. Not the view, the same streets, the same buildings, the same people moving through their lives. But looking at it from a place that was his changed what he saw in it. Small differences, the kind that added up. He walked back along the forest path the way he'd come. His phone, a real one now, one that had service and a full charge, buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A text from Devereaux. "You went back to the clearing." Ezra stopped walking. He looked at the message. He typed back, "How did you know?" The response came fast. "Because I did too. Last week. I didn't mention it." Ezra stood on the path and looked at those words for a moment. Then he typed, "What did you do when you were there?" A pause. Longer than the others. Then stood there. Thought about how close it was. Thought about you. Went home. Ezra put the phone back in his pocket. He kept walking. The path curved left and the forest opened onto the park's edge and the city started up again. Concrete and noise and the particular smell of a street after rain, diesel and wet leaves and something from the bakery on the corner that hit warm and sweet. He stopped on the sidewalk. A woman passed him walking a dog. A kid on a bike. A man in a suit checking his phone without looking up. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. And Ezra Calloway, who had spent most of his life moving through spaces like this one without a single person registering that he was there, stood on the sidewalk and felt the city around him and knew, in a way that was quiet and certain and completely new, that he was no longer invisible. Not because anyone had announced it. Not because his circumstances had changed completely, they hadn't, not entirely. There were still hard days. Still the particular loneliness that came from not being able to use your voice the way other people did. Still moments when the world moved too fast and the people in it moved past him without slowing. But something had changed at the root of it. He had stepped forward in a dark forest with nothing but a rusted knife and a lighter, and a man who should have been buried in the ground was instead standing in federal court giving testimony that mattered. He had done that, nobody else. And the doing of it had changed what he believed was possible. Not for the world, he was not that optimistic, not yet. But for himself. For the specific ordinary life of Ezra Calloway, who had been 12 years old when his voice stopped working and had spent every year since then trying to figure out what that meant about who he was. He knew now. It meant nothing about who he was. It had never meant anything about who he was. Devereaux called him that evening. Phone call, not text. Devereaux had figured out the system. He talked, Ezra listened. Ezra typed responses into a shared notes document that Devereaux watched on his end in real time. Inefficient by most measures. There's entirely. Devereaux said, "Adrian wants to know if you'd be willing to speak at the center. Opening event." She said speak and then corrected herself. Communicate. Her word. He paused. "She means, would you be willing to be there? In front of people. In your own way." Ezra opened the notes document on his phone. He typed, "What would I say?" Devereaux was quiet for a moment. Then, "Whatever you've been writing in those notebooks." Ezra looked at the shelf on the wall. The 2 filled notebooks and the third half full. Everything in them. The forest, the shed, the granola wrapper, 5 days of hunger and ordinary terror. A folded tarp in an empty room. a man who asked why and listened to the answer on a piece of paper. What would he say? He typed, "I'll think about it." Devereaux said, "That's a yes from you." Ezra almost smiled. He typed, "Don't push it." "I'm not pushing. I'm reading you accurately." Ezra closed the notes doc and looked out the window. The city at evening, lit up and moving and full of people living their lives in every direction. Most of them never knowing how close the ordinary moments were to something that could break everything open. He thought about the shovels, the sound of them in the dark, before he even saw the men. The moment he decided to stop walking. He understood now, completely with no part of it theoretical, that the decision he had made in that moment was not about Devereaux Cole. It was not about money or power or what he stood to gain. It was about the version of himself he would have had to become if he had kept walking. He could not have lived with that person. So he had stopped. And everything else. The fear, the cold, the running, the shed, the hunger, the empty shack, the bodyguard on the steps, the food on the plate, the notebook, the convoy, the cold room, the zip tie, the stolen phone, the wet street, and 6 months of slowly learning to believe that a life built without anyone watching out for you could still become something worth having. All of it came from that one decision. One motion. In the dark. That was what courage actually looked like. He had decided. Not a dramatic thing. Not loud. Just the choice you made in the 10 seconds when everything told you to turn around, the choice to stay, to move, to not walk away from what you could not walk away from and remain who you needed to be. He stood at the window until the city went fully dark. Then he sat down at the small table, opened the notebook to the next blank page, and wrote, "If you made it to this moment with Ezra and Devereaux, through the forest and the shed and everything that came after, this story was for you. The ones who have felt invisible. The ones who made the hard call when no one was watching. The ones who know that being seen is not weakness. It is survival. If the story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your comment in the section below could be the thing that reminds someone they are not alone. And if you want more stories like this one, stories that hit hard, that stay with you, that make you feel something real, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already coming. And it starts in the dark just like this one did.